Greetings, friends of liberty. When I survey our glorious city and see the degree to which it has, like a sprouting toddler, grown both in height and heft, I can only marvel. Such industry, such art, such abundance found everywhere. Did you know that in the year 1500, the population of the city stood perhaps at 80,000 souls? In 1600, 300,000 souls. Mid 1700, at the start of this century. 500,000, and today 'tis approaching or has even surpassed 1 million inhabitants. Now, one of the many challenges of incorporating so many rural or village country folk who migrate to Whitechapel, or Southwark, or St. Giles in the Fields, also known as Little Dublin, is that sometimes they are taken advantage of by cunning pickpockets or fraudsters. Even worse can occur when girls or young women, seeing no great prospects for making a living in the harsh environs of the city and no references to recommend them, are, in their desperation, enticed into prostitution, being courted by handsome and suave ruffians, and often plied with drink or drugs. Not infrequently, they may be raped and then coerced into the trade. This practice appears amenable to no easy solution, other than to expand the size of the police forces, to educate girls and young women about the dangers of these types of men, and to capture the rapists. Now, if we turn to the issue of men enticing young women with fraudulent claims of love and affection, which we all want, drawing them into a life of promiscuity, prostitution, or even worse, in your own 21st century in England, we find today under review the recently released Casey Report, National Audit on Group-Based Child Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, whose author is Baroness Louise Casey of Blackstock. This report, actually her second, her first focusing on the town of Rotherham and having been published in 2015, serves as a preliminary audit to an upcoming and much-needed national inquiry on Britain's 40-year-old grooming gang scandal, which likely involves tens of thousands of victims, if not more. Let's briefly review some highlights of her 8 chapters and her conclusion, and then evaluate the totality. Chapter number 1, her introduction. Here she quotes Alexis Jay, a professor and former social worker, who described in her own 2014 National Report on England and Wales some of the appalling treatment that grooming gangs engage in. The girls being raped by many men, sent as prostitutes to other cities and towns, kidnapped and beaten. Some were soaked in gasoline and threatened with a lighted match, others with guns. One had her tongue nailed to a table, and others made witness to exceedingly brutal rapes, and also routinely threatened into a complicitous silence. In Chapter 2, she gives us an extensive timeline of important events and governmental reports. It includes, by my count, 94 items. For example, starting in 2011, journalist Andrew Norfolk's first story on grooming gangs appeared in the Times. In 2014, Professor Alex Jay's report, commissioned by Rotherham Council, laid bare that an estimated 1,400 children had been sexually exploited between 1997 and 2013, mainly by men of Asian ethnicity. In 2017, the BBC airs the TV drama 3 Girls on the Rochdale abuse. In 2018, 20 men, all of British, Asian, and predominantly Pakistani ethnicity, are convicted in Huddersfield as part of Operation Tender Sea. In 2022, the Prime Minister meets with child sexual exploitation survivors in Leeds and Greater Manchester, announcing the establishment of the Tackling Child Sexual Exploitation Task Force. And in December 2024, His Majesty's Constabulary and Fire Rescue Services published the National Child Protection Inspection into Greater Manchester Police. When one reads through these 94 items, it's surprising how many reports have been made, governmental task forces set up, and conferences attended, but how little actually accomplished in terms of the bottom line, convictions. As Ms. Casey says, moments of scandal and public outrage lead to bursts of government focus and activity, but no sustained improvement, leaving victims and the public with insufficient justice, action, accountability, or answers. Chapter 3, the scale of the problem. First, overall, with a broader, more generalized term of child sexual abuse, not necessarily group-based or exploitation, we find that the police recorded crime data shows just over 100,000 offenses of child sexual abuse and exploitation recorded annually, with around 2/3, 60% of these being contact offenses. And so about 40% originated or occurred online. Secondly, there are massive data collection problems. So while new police data has identified around 700 recorded offenses of group-based child sexual exploitation in 2023, it is highly unlikely that this accurately reflects the true scale of child sexual exploitation or group-based sexual exploitation. And so there remains no accurate assessment of these varied crimes nationwide. Why has data not been collected after likely 40 years of grooming gangs existing? Partly it's complicated by the fact that victims can be afraid of reporting these crimes to the authorities, with only around 7% of victims and survivors informing the police at the time of the offense, and with only about 18% informing the police at any point. This contrasts with reporting rates of burglary, which are around 58% and 34% for theft. This reticence may sometimes occur because victims are threatened with retribution. Partly, as we will see later, many involved professionals themselves may be afraid of effectively using the data they do get because they're afraid of being called racist. Partly, too, the problem may be that women suspects that believe that nothing will be done, even if they do report the crimes. Chapter 4, the nature and characteristics of group-based child sexual exploitation. Among characteristic gang traits, we find them plying girls with alcohol and drugs to make them more compliant and giving them gifts, more initiation of grooming online now, moving children around, sometimes using different hotels, girls sometimes participating in crimes themselves, the inhibitions of the perpetrators being apparently loosened when they're acting together in a group, perhaps intensifying bad effects, 70% of the group-based offenders being employed in the nighttime economy, they sometimes using taxicab drivers to ferry girls around, sometimes the girls engaging in drug trafficking and selling, sometimes the gangs engaging in drug trafficking and selling, girls being recruited at parties, often advertised on Facebook or Snapchat, girls sometimes gone from their families for days on end, some victims having learning or physical disabilities, which renders them more vulnerable, a high percent of white victims, ranging from 87 to 94% or more, and finally, victims often don't view the relationship as abusive. With regard to the ethnicity of the perpetrators, Ms. Casey reviews numerous public and private reports saying that the ethnicity of perpetrators could be identified in 15 cases, either by the review itself or open source research. 10 reports involve perpetrators of predominantly Asian or Pakistani ethnicity. 1 involved perpetrators predominantly from a range of ethnic minority backgrounds, including Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, Iranian, Iraqi, Kurdish, Turkish, Albanian, and Eastern European. 1 involved black, 1 involved Turkish, 1 involved Somali, and 1 involved white perpetrators. She concludes by saying, while not representative of a national picture, it was notable that the majority of these involved perpetrators from Asian and Pakistani ethnic backgrounds. Chapter 5, the often absent state safety net. First, one notable aspect here to note is that while police reports have entered increasing numbers of cases, perhaps simply because the police are more conscious of this crime than they were previously, the number of cases recorded instead by child services has dropped significantly. So, for example, in 1993-4, there were equal numbers of children placed on child protection plans for neglect, 6,400, and sexual abuse, 6,400. 30 years later, the number of children on child protection plans for neglect has risen to 30,950, while those for sexual abuse has fallen to 2,160. So before the ratio of neglect to sexual abuse was 1-to-1, now it is 14-to-1. This is illustrated by examples like the following, where a 13-year-old girl had been raped by 3 different men who was nonetheless on a child protection plan for neglect. So not categorized under child sexual exploitation, but neglect. Secondly, in England, there are also 47 sexual assault referral centers, which recorded a total of 9,533 initial contacts with under 18s. These tend to have, according to Ms. Casey, a relatively hands-off approach into inquiring whether crimes may have been committed by girls that come to them. Thirdly, the Police National Database, PND, is designed to, or should be, perfect for entering this type of data nationwide. But unfortunately, it doesn't work well, since officers need a license to access it, and the number of officers who can use the PND is limited due to the lack of capacity in the system, with wait times of up to 18 months just to enter a search for data. As Ms. Casey says, of these and other systems, the current poor state of police intelligence systems means that it does far too little to assist police forces with the gathering and sharing of information about perpetrators and potential victims. Chapter 6, Denial. Widespread denial is one of the more important and puzzling aspects of the whole grooming gang scandal. Ms. Casey believes that denial is extensive, exhibited, for example, by A, in the failure to collect ethnicity data because it might implicate Muslims or Pakistanis, flawed data being used repeatedly, flawed data, to dismiss claims about Asian grooming gangs as sensationalized, biased, or untrue. B, in the failure of professionals to attempt to understand why the fact that the men were Asian might in fact have been relevant and legitimate for consideration. C, the police would sometimes say that local authorities would discourage them from publicizing the successful conviction of perpetrators of group-based child sexual exploitation due to fears of raising tensions, which is unfortunate since this is a well-established method for police to encourage other victims to come forward. D, in a particularly damaging instance, a report by the think tank Quilliam, which had claimed that 84% of group-based child sexual abuse was committed by Asian heritage men, was dismissed by researchers because the methodology and selection process used by Quilliam was not stated. This dismissal was then endorsed by the Home Office in their 2020 report. E, Ms. Casey believes these girl victims should be treated as children until age 16, she believing that not doing so is also a form of denial of their childhood status. F, the simple failure to hold people accountable exhibited by so many institutions can itself be seen as a symptom of denial, as typified by the fact that sometimes it takes years for people to be persuaded for the need of an independent public inquiry or review. Another typical expression was when Andrew Norfolk in 2013 published the story of the victim, Amy, and the Rotherham City Council responded by launching a criminal inquiry into who had leaked the material to him. Notoriously in Rotherham, across years of failure, no single individual has been held accountable for what everyone accepts were injustices. G, in police accountability, is there such a thing? One report found that despite 265 separate allegations being made by more than 50 complainants, no officer lost their job. This was after 8 years of costly investigations. Chapter 7, Taxi Licensing. Since taxis are sometimes used as accessories to crimes of trafficking and prostitution, she recommends much stricter licensing of them with mandatory internal cameras. Chapter 8, Age of Consent. A. The age of consent in England and Wales is broadly similar to other European countries, higher than in France, 15, In Germany, 14, lower than in the Republic of Ireland, 17, and the same as in Spain, Norway, and the Netherlands, 16. B. Some countries have so-called Romeo and Juliet clauses, which make it a lesser offense for people to have sex who are close in age. C. She laments what she calls a gray area in the law, where 13 to 15-year-olds are treated as more mature than she believes they should be. D. She finds it personally shocking the type of daily discussions police officers, prosecutors, barristers, judges, and juries are having about children under the age of consent having sex with adults. She again defining a child as anyone under the age of 16. She calls this treatment of 13 to 15-year-olds adultification, and thus recommends making any sex under 16 statutory rape like the French do. Let's turn to her final recommendations. Number 1, a national criminal investigation to prosecute the perpetrators of child sexual exploitation should be scoped and planned in detail by the Home Office and then coordinated with local police forces. Number 2, also desired, would be a review of cases that have been reported which have not resulted in prosecutions over the last 10 years. Number 3, the creation of an independent commission which should review cases of failures or obstruction by statutory services to identify localities where further local investigation should be instigated. Number 4, nullifying any convictions of victims where the government finds victims were criminalized instead of protected. Number 5, making mandatory the collection and sharing of ethnicity and nationality data for all suspects. 6, police information systems should be upgraded and provide unique reference numbers for children. 7, that child sexual exploitation investigation should be approached like organized crime investigations. 8, that the government should commission research into the causes of group-based child sexual exploitation. And finally, number 9, the government should commit to fully resourcing these recommendations over multiple years and to tracking their implementation across departments and other organizations with regular reports to Parliament. So having given a bare-bones outline of the contents of our 197-page report, let's turn to a number of related aspects. Number 1, first, the issue of statutory rape. When should a woman be able to give consent to having sex with anyone? Since the issue should be decided biologically, I would argue her age of first menstruation plus about 18 months, after which most people looking at her would say she's a woman. On average then, since a girl in Britain has her first period at around age 11 years, 10 months, if we call that 12 years and then add 18 months to essentially complete puberty, the age of consent should then be, on average, 13 and a half. Of course, this is much younger than Miss Casey and others want, but the reality is that a sexually mature woman, which someone at this stage essentially is unquestionably biologically an adult human female. Miss Casey, however, constantly calls adult human females children in this report, thus infantilizing them. Secondly is the issue of immorality versus illegality. The fact that it should be legal for a man of any age to have sex with an adult human female obviously doesn't mean that it's moral or advisable. This is in fact one function that mothers and fathers have played since time immemorial in protecting their young daughters from being seduced by older men whose attentions are ill-suited or not serious. In other words, in many societies, older men would justifiably have to run the gauntlet of many concerned family members. But this again should be an issue of morality, not legality, once sexual maturity has been reached. Thirdly, sex between two people who are close to the same age should never be criminal. So if a 10-year-old and 9-year-old are fooling around, that's up to them and no crime has been committed. This is why many countries have Romeo and Juliet laws, because we all recognize this, except Miss Casey, who would jail a 17-year-old male for rape for having consensual sex with a consenting 15-year-old adult human female. Fourthly, since consent can be violated by intimidation and since the threat of violence is present in many of these cases, by my standards, the ones I've just outlined here, 90+% of all the cases we're talking about would be rape at some point because the consent of the girls was violated either explicitly or by intimidation. So grooming per se would not be illegal. What would be illegal would be any use of intimidation, threats, or violence, which usually start after the initial period and are very frequently used by these men. So a violation of the girl's consent. Fifthly, the Dutch, having the same problem with Muslims, specifically made it a focus to educate their children in schools about the danger. But as Peter McLaughlin, whose book Easy Meat I reviewed here, commented, British elementary schools explicitly rejected showing an advisory film called My Dangerous Lover Boy, which would have educated girls about this and appear to not have given them any type of caution. This was unfortunate since it would have heightened the awareness of girls to the dangers they might face in dating and relationships. Sixthly, as I've mentioned in many other reviews, as for example again in my review of McLaughlin's Easy Meat, as well as in the video, was Alison Pearson's recent Telegraph article, The Perfect Grooming Gang Scandal Column. The spread of multiculturalism, as many recognize, has been as important a cause as any other in indoctrinating much of British and American liberal society into accepting the false idea that all ethnic groups are the same. And thus, multiculturalists believe that it would be racist to imagine that Muslims or Pakistanis are more likely, probably somewhere between 5 to 15 times, to commit grooming gang crimes. Now, Ms. Casey doesn't touch on the important issue of multiculturalism or how it arose, which was through the educational system. Or she doesn't touch on the complementary issue of the Equality Act and how it also reinforced multiculturalism at a legal and institutional level. But that's not really her job here. In conclusion, I dearly hope that the upcoming national inquiry, which Ms. Casey's audit has preceded, can successfully identify and prosecute the many perpetrators and even some of their official enablers who remain at large. It would be an enormous national achievement for Britain to bring some measure of justice to the likely tens of thousands of victims for whom justice has until now been denied. Crossing my fingers for the success of the upcoming inquiry, which will not be easily achieved at the institutional level, given the many culpable individuals who will want to escape punishment, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.